The next is from Christopher, and just hardly any less nuanced. He says, I've had great fun playing Melee and Wizard over the years since I bought them. I own and read into the Labyrinth. I own and read Into the Labyrinth, and quite like it as much as well as one can without actually using it to play. Never used it for play, only doing small skirmishes or duels with Melee Wizard. So, would you say that it's still something there worth to explore? Using it for full-on dungeon exploration? And if so, any wisdoms, hints, and tips before one actually does it? This is kind of huge, really. First of all, with apologies, I lose no opportunity to wave these around in one of the original, rather nasty now, plastic packs. I've got, my copies from way back when of Melee, of course, and Wizard. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the original publications are quite slim little staple-bound books, which I regard as probably my favorite form factor in all of role-playing. And they were sold separately, and they each came with a little, fold-out hex map. Very iconic. So this was called metagaming back in 1977, beginning with Ogre for its micro games. A bunch of others, Warp War and Chitin and so forth. I have these. And when the fantasy trip, so-called, Melee came out, the fantasy trip Wizard, and there's some throwaway text in there about how you might see your way toward, putting a bunch of these characters together and taking them down a corridor like an attack squad. They call it a special weapons section. They were built effectively as drop-ins for, at the time called fantasy wargaming, which means playing D&D, or what you think is D&D, and you don't know how to do a fight, and they're basically saying, here, use this. And soon, an expansion for Melee was produced. No Wizard rules, called Death Test, which is basically, a choose your way through this little labyrinth in a kind of a, can you survive way. When Wizard came out, more death tests. Another death test was included. A little better play tested, a little bit better, oriented toward what people do with the rules, as well as something quite interesting. I only have the original paper book that it came with, rather, that you're supposed to use it with Melee. It's called Grail Quest. This one was actually kind of interesting because your behavioral choices mattered a lot. But Grail Quest came out, and I think Death Test 2 may have, when In the Labyrinth was published in 1980, which is this. It is a magazine format. Now, In the Labyrinth is a little tricky because you get this and you're supposed to use Melee and Wizard with it, or either or both of Advanced Melee and Advanced Wizard. So you could just have these, and you've got effectively up to date In the Labyrinth. It's kind of a mess of what texts are what. To make things even more complicated, due to various legalities, Steve Jackson did not retain those properties. When he founded Steve Jackson Games, he took the principles of play and paid attention to a lot of other role-playing and design that was going on in order to make GURPS later. But these remained with metagaming, which promptly produced a bunch of kind of crap products, Talonkar's Lair and a bunch of other kind of nonsense, and fell apart. There are a few other interesting things in there. Some of you will remember the silver dragon hunt and other strange things that metagaming found itself doing. So anyway, what are we looking at when we say these games and what we might find worthwhile in them? For those of you who don't know, Melee and Wizard are, as written, dueling games. You fight, it's a 2-player game or multiple person, but 2 sides for sure, and you fight each other. And it's pretty brutal. I mean, whoever slaughters everyone on the other side wins. That's all. What to make of that? Well, the color text in both of them, brief though it is remarkably compelling. And the notion that, we should play this in the context of such social and emotional contexts as are described there briefly, well, we could do this. And I think I speak for quite a lot of my age group when we say, yeah, that color text actually activated us far more than any of the other texts available in the late 70s. Okay, let's look at In the Labyrinth as a role-playing game. As you will see, people taking 3 fantasies, there is some weirdness going on here. It is, after all, called In the Labyrinth. So Christopher's implication that to fully explore the game, you explore a dungeon, is a reasonable response to just looking at its title. But I don't know if you'll agree, Christopher, but upon reading the thing, one of the things that you don't find in there is a whole lot of dungeon. In fact, it's very oriented toward the vast, sprawling, anything can be found, any ecology, any combination of, races or species or whatever, any context of science and magic, sprawling across this vast constructed planet called Sidri. And the whole point of Sidri is only to be anywhere. And pretty much outdoor encounters, I've just opened it up. Outdoor encounters, economic systems. There's stuff about creating a labyrinth and stocking it. And there is, of course, this famous, set of hexes in the middle, which I personally, photocopied out and then, or not, I didn't photocopy them out. I bought hex paper. I still have these. Bought hex paper and colored each level, separately. So to copying this map. So that's in there, but really there's no conceptual support for that particularly at all. The characters have jobs. They need to maintain their incomes. The idea of going on an adventure and entering a labyrinth, and there's march order and stuff like that is all in there, but it really exists in a bubble compared to all the other stuff. All the stuff about demons and Sasquatches and ghouls and stuff like that is less about encountering them in a dungeon and more about encountering them when they're doing the things that they're up to. And the nature of character creation and the nature of context for the character. I mean, you get this and that and the other traits because you want to play a samurai. This or that another trait because you want to play, a snotty wizard, as opposed to a kind one, is surprisingly strong. So it's hard to see. I mean, despite, the title and despite a certain amount of the material in there, I can say in my experience of playing this thing, and I tried for years, going into the labyrinth killed play. Everything that we had set up, everything that people had fun with in making their characters, everything we did about role-playing them and their circumstances and what it's like on the job and, how that ended up with trouble for them and all sorts of things just disappeared when we went into the labyrinth. So I guess it's a 2-part response. Part 1 is to say, you should play it. I think that it has all sorts of strange artifacts in it. resolution-wise and concept-wise, that are worth discovering. Some of them I think are kind of positive, some of them I don't like. But it was the game that I obsessed over. It is the game that I internalized. And eventually I realized that aspects of In the Labyrinth might do better stripped out, and Wizard alone be, partake of some of In the Labyrinth stuff. That led to thinking about their creation and demon summoning spells and how that might be done, and that has a direct line to sorcerer. But the lessons from trying to play In the Labyrinth were very, very strong. And I recommend it to anybody. I don't know what lessons you'll get out of it, but you'll learn something. And really working through the turn sequences and the movements and the options and the mechanisms of Melee and Wizard, advanced or not, is also critically important, basically, for understanding an enormous sector of role-playing game design historically. So yes, it is worth exploring, if by exploring you mean play. But strangely, and who knows, maybe someone will disagree, and also, who knows, maybe someone will have this great time with it, but from my experience, exploring the game, in other words, playing it, does not actually reach much fun insofar as you are exploring a dungeon. There's a lot more in there, a lot more content in there textually that sparks other kinds of interactions and problems. So that's my take on it. Yes, and what for? And with any hope, I've managed to convey a little bit of why. Perhaps, if you're interested, I could continue a little bit with some mechanics points. Beginning characters have 32 points total across strength, dexterity, and intelligence. The play and their improvement, which is pretty much necessary to keep from just being a disposable potato chip, has a tendency to ruin the economy or the identity that you get from the economy. When you say, okay, I'm not a very strong fellow, but I'm quite fast. Well, once everybody has gained points, above a certain level, and everybody's, 15 or 16 out of 18 for all three of those, you've kind of lost that. And I'm not so sure. I mean, there's aspects of the improvement and the way play proceeds over time. I mean, you have to do it, especially with Magic, and you have to do it to get the various talents and abilities that you need for your character's identity. But right about the point when you've achieved that combo of stuff they do that you like, numerically, they've sort of lost who they are. So, fatal or not, I don't know, but it's an issue, as I discovered anyway. So leading us to Sean on his question, a couple of questions. One is about criticals. And he says, a few years back in conversation with other BRP RuneQuest fans, I learned that a large number of players relied heavily on criticals and impales to win combats, also as a means of judging degrees of success and the rock, paper, scissors of attack and parry. Okay, I'll stop right there, because this is one of these really dense paragraphs that makes leaps of logic. And so I'll stop right here and say nothing but yes. For those of you who don't know, you have a percentage to hit, and then 20% of that percent is your chance for an impale. Impales do heinous damage. And then a small percentage inside that is your critical. Critical means it ignores armor, which in RuneQuest is all important, particularly because in RuneQuest you don't have much improvement in actual bodily composition. Your own personal hit points do not necessarily improve, and if they do, not to there's no, quantum jump at all. There's just some improvement. So the idea here is that you also have critical parries, and you also have when attacks and parries both succeed, or when a parry succeeds and an attack doesn't, and whether whether that parry is a critical. All these things create blocks of percentages rather than, okay, I have a percent for this and he has a percent for that, as if they were independent things. They are very much interactive, creating new percentages that a lot of people I've found don't seem to be able to verbally process. But those new percentages are actually the resolution system. So it's actually really quite strong. Two characters who are skilled in attacking and parrying will have a very, very different fight from two characters who aren't. And it's not just a matter that, they will hit more often. They'll actually probably hit less often. But the attrition on their weapons and whose weapon breaks, that shit matters. So the skilled fight looks a lot different from the unskilled fight. And again, though, to get to your point, it is a matter of really focusing on when those criticals jump in. And they're not tiny percentages. Once you get up above 50, 60% to hit or to parry, then your chance for a critical is reasonably likely to happen, through a series of passages of arms during the fight, and that will usually turn the tide of what occurs, creating an effect that we see very, very similarly in fiction, and to some extent in reality, at least in a kind of society for creative anachronism sense. So what we, which is no small thing. I mean, a pretty athletic activity, really. So if you just look at the BRP and RuneQuest thing, those criticals and impales and things are not the same as they are in other games. They do different things, and they interact mathematically in a unique way that you just don't find in other games. So the next step when you, and I think it's very strong. Okay. So then the next step in the paragraph, which is kind of where I balked a little, it says, this reaches a peak, I think, in Rollmaster's many descriptive critical hits and fumbles. Okay, let's stop there, because I think that's a completely different thing. Mathematically, the way it occurs is different. And it also has a, for lack of a better word, a kind of a grotesque element that turns the fight more into a farce. In my experience, having played a fair amount of Rollmaster as well. And almost to the point where it's sort of more fun to read up and down the tables, describing the various clinical nastiness that can occur, as if that were the fun of what's going on. That's a pretty negative way to put it. Maybe my experience with it is different from yours. But I agree that there was, at that time, by the mid-'80s, a kind of a fascination with the various appalling things that could occur, a whole bunch of them, each one associated with a small percent of some kind. Notice that in RuneQuest, you don't have critical hit tables with a whole bunch of descriptions. You have the one fumble table, and that's it. The criticals are simply a matter of damage and armor as numbers. So the notion of the table of clinically described results of criticals, that has a different origin. And that's specifically, the Morrow Project, which I have realized has a long tentacles through role-playing design for decades, and actually may have impacted on GURPS a lot more than I had realized until recently.